Professor Oded Lifshitz from the Department of Archaeology and Ancient Near Eastern Cultures at Tel Aviv University is inviting you to join him to a journey following those who composed the historical descriptions in the Hebrew Bible.
The Untold Story of the Kingdom of Judah, Part B. In sight, in mind, but far away in time. The Untold Stories of Ancient Jerusalem. Chapter 5. The untold story of how to make renovations in the temple and how Solomon's altar was replaced with a new Aramaic altar. Although there were other temples in Judah, apart from the king's temple built by Solomon in Jerusalem, with the establishment of the rule of the house of David, the strengthening of the status of Jerusalem as the capital, and the consolidation of the administrative and economic framework of the kingdom, the temple in Jerusalem gradually became, during the hundreds of years of the existence of the kingdom of Judah, the center of the people's religious and cultic life. However, with all the importance of the temple and despite its centrality, I doubt that the Jerusalem historiographers had reliable written sources of information about the temple's past and about its history. It was easy for them to describe its construction since the temple built by Solomon continued to exist for hundreds of years without being destroyed. Its rather modest dimensions had not changed. The location of the temple at the top of the hill above the city was well known. Its basic plan and direction, as well as its architectural components, remained as they were when first constructed. The temple vessels remained as they were, and apparently even if vessels were added and changed, the biblical historiography attributed all the cultic vessels to Solomon, even after the temple was destroyed and Babylonians took some of the vessels to Babylon. Apparently, the main changes were to the courtyard and the various buildings that continued to develop around the temple, between the temple and the palace, and down the hill towards the Ophel. What did historiographers know about the changes and developments that had been made to the temple? Was there a chronicle that documented and described these changes? In this chapter, I suggest that the small and modest temple, which stood in the center of Jerusalem, was so familiar and close to those who lived in the city and those who visited it and made pilgrimage to it, that this intimate acquaintance didn't have to rely on written chronicles, whether the historiographers needed in their description reference to the history of the temple. The memory of changes and developments that took place in the temple was rooted in the temple objects themselves, in the structure of the temple and in its surroundings, and in various places within the temple that had been tied to the memory of what had been and what had changed. I will demonstrate this using two examples. The first is more technical and deals with the method used in the days of King Jehoash of Judah to make renovations in the temple, and the second is related to the replacement of Solomon's altar in the days of King Ahaz. One of the central events in the history of religion and cult in Judah, and hence also in shaping the national consciousness and historical memory, took place in the 18th year of Josiah's reign. A book was discovered during the preparations made for renovations in the temple. It's described in the second book of Kings, chapter 22, verses 8 to 10. According to the description of the sequence of events that led to the finding of the book, Josiah initiated the beginning of the process when he sent Shaphan, the scribe, to the temple with three simple instructions. This is in the second book of Kings, chapter 22, verses 4 to 7. The first instruction is to go to the temple and count the silver that was brought there and was collected by the gatekeepers. according to the description in verse 4, I'm quoting, "Go up to Hilkiah the high priest, that he may reckon the amount of the silver which has been brought into the house of Yahweh, which the keepers of the threshold have collected from the people." The second is to give the silver to those in charge of the renovations at the temple, apparently so that they can check and decide what work needs to be carried during the renovations within the existing budget. It's verse 5a, the first part of verse 5. "And let them deliver it into the hand of the doers of the work, that have the oversight of the house of Yahweh." The third instruction is to make sure that those in charge of the renovations give the silver to the craftsmen who are supposed to carry out the renovation work. It's in verse 5b, second part of verse 5 and 6. I'm quoting. "And let them give it to the workmen who are at the house of Yahweh, repairing the breaches of the house, that is, to the carpenters, and to the builders, and to the masons, as well as for buying timber and quarried stone, repairing the breaches of the house." End of quote. The king added one more comment to Shaphan the scribe, and this is in verse 7. "But no accounting shall be asked for them for the silver which is delivered into their hand, for they deal faithfully." The readers of the story do not know which of the king's instructions were fulfilled, if any, because immediately after reporting these instructions of the king to Shaphan, the story switches to what Hilkiah, the high priest, said to Shaphan, apparently when the latter came to the former to fulfill the king's first order and check the renovation budget together from the silver collected by the gatekeepers. And I'm quoting from verse 8. "And Hilkiah the high priest said to Shaphan the scribe, I have found the book of the law in the house of Yahweh." Hilkiah hands the book to Shaphan, and he reads it and hurried to report to the king about what he found. However, when Shaphan meets the king, he first reports to him about the fulfillment of the instruction the king gave to him for carrying out the renovations in the temple. Responding to the king's instruction to reckon the amount of the silver which has been brought into the house of Yahweh in verse 4, Shaphan reports in verse 9, "Your servants have gathered the silver that was found in the house." End of quote. And in response to the instruction, and I'm quoting, "And let them deliver it into the hand of the doers of the work that have the oversight of the house of Yahweh." This is the second command in verse 5a. Shaphan reports that the servants have delivered it into the hand of the doers of the work who have the oversight of the house of Yahweh, and this is in verse 9. However, according to Shaphan's report, preparation for the renovation had not yet reached to the stage of handing the silver over the craftsmen who were supposed to carry out the actual renovation work when the book was found. So the third instruction was not fulfilled yet in verse 10. "Then Shaphan the scribe told the king, Hilkiah the priest had given me a book." And Shaphan read the book in front of the king. Hence, according to the report, the book was found during the preparation for the renovations and the supervisor's examination of what should be done with the silver collected for the renovations before the renovation themselves began. At this point, the story moves on to the king's reaction when he heard of the content of the book, to the delegation he sent to the prophetess Huldah, and it continues from there to the description of the cult reform that was carried out in Judah as a result. The fate that befell the renovations in the temple remains unknown. The instruction that Josiah gave to Shaphan the scribe were neither the outcome of the king's own initiative nor representative of his own decisions. They were part of an orderly system that, according to the description in the second book of Kings, chapter 12, had been operating in the temple since the days of King Jehoash, about 200 years prior the King Josiah's reign, the renovation he had wanted to make in the temple, and the finding of the book of the law that led to the cult reform in Judah. According to the description of the days of Jehoash, the old methods of maintaining the temple and routinely, periodically renovating it no longer worked. This method was based on priests collecting donations and allocating part of the donations for the renovation and maintenance of the temple. The priests did collect the donations, but didn't allocate it towards renovations. According to the description in the second book of Kings, chapter 12, verse 6, by the 23rd year of King Jehoash, the priests had not repaired the breaches of the house. The king realized that he needed to change the system and decided to forbid the priests from collecting the silver and free them for the obligation of allocating the budget for temple renovations. According to the description in verses 7 and 8 in the second book of Kings, chapter 12, I'm quoting, therefore, King Joash called for Jehoiada the priest and for the other priests and said to them, why are you not repairing breaches of the house? Now, therefore, take no more silver from your acquaintance, but hand it over for the breaches of the house. So the priests agreed that they should not take more silver from the people, neither repair the breaches of the house. The finance, the renovation of the temple, the king ordered that a new method be used. According to the description in the second book of Kings, chapter 12, verse 9, at the heart of the new system was a method of collecting silver from the pilgrims to the temple. I'm quoting. Then, Jehoiada the priest took a chest and bored a hole in the lid of it and set it beside the altar on the right side as one entered the house of Yahweh. And the priests who guarded the threshold put in it all the silver that was brought into the house of Yahweh. From that moment, the method began to operate exactly the way King Josiah instructed Shaphan the scribe about 200 years later. First, verse 10, whenever they saw that there was much silver in the chest, the king's scribe and the high priest came up and they counted and tied up in bags the silver that was found in the house of Yahweh. The responsibility for counting the silver was, as mentioned, placed upon the king's scribe and the high priest as a form of checks and balances between the two authorities. This is the stage where, according to the new system, the silver should go to those in charge of carrying out the renovations so that they can decide what to do within the given budget. This is in verse 11a. Then they would give the silver that was weighed out into the hands of the doers of the work that have the oversight of the house of Yahweh. The role of these doers of the work was to give the appropriate budget to the craftsmen who carried out the actual renovations based on the decision of what renovations were necessary. Indeed, this is the third stage according to the description in verses 11b and 12. I'm quoting. And they paid it out to the carpenters and the builders who worked upon the house of Yahweh, and to the masons and to the stone cutters, as well as to buy timber and quarried stone, to repair the breaches of the house of Yahweh, and for all that was laid out for the house to repair it. End of quote. According to verse 13, the silver collected would be allocated entirely for the renovations and must not be used to create sacred vessels for temple worship, And in this case as well, as Josiah is instructed, the concluding comment is in verse 15, but no accounting shall be asked from them for the silver which is delivered into the hand, for they deal faithfully. Many researchers have tried to understand the connection between this system, which, according to the biblical description, as it is written, was founded in the days of Jehoash and operated for about 200 years until the days of Josiah. Clearly, if this method did work and was known to everyone who lived in Jerusalem, made a pilgrimage to the temple, saw the wooden chest within their own eyes, placed some silver into it as a donation for the renovation of the temple, and witnessed the way in which the high priest and the scribe used this silver to carry out the temple renovations, then the writers of the description in the book of Kings also based their writings on this information and described it to the public who also knew the methods. Although some scholars claimed that the description of the days of Josiah reflected a well-known reality, and this description was projected by the Deuteronomistic authors onto the description of the renovation in the days of Jehoash, I find it hard to understand the reason why these authors projected the known method from their day onto the days of King Jehoash and what they wanted to achieve in so doing. Even more, researchers have claimed that the description of the method introduced in the days of Jehoash is the original, and the information about it came from documents kept in the temple, or from the book of Chronicles to the king of Judah, or from the temple archive, and the authors of the Deuteronomistic history projected this method onto the days of King Josiah as the background for finding the book and the cult reform. I cannot accept this explanation either, because if there was a known method for renovating the temple, then why would there be a need for sources to describe it, and why not assume that it continued to operate and was known to the audience that read the descriptions in the time when they were written, most likely in the days of King Josiah? During this period, those who wrote the description wrote it for an audience that was well acquainted with the conduct of the temple. I cannot assume that it was possible to invent a method from the past that didn't continue to operate even at the time when the historiographic descriptions were written. Indeed, Nadav Naaman even claimed that the description of the renovation of the days of Jehoash were based on a royal building inscription, which I find it difficult to accept because this description is not about construction or renovations, but about an administrative method to collect silver to be used for renovations in the temple. These subjects are never included in royal building inscriptions, and I find it also hard to assume that they were covered in any texts from the temple archive. In light of this, I suggest that, in this case, the chest was the only tangible item that was connected to the system that began to operate in the days of Jehoash, and the same chest was still in use during the reign of King Josiah as part of the same system that collected silver for temple renovations. There is no need to speculate about a royal building inscription, since the details described in the two Deuteronomistic descriptions are technical details which were obvious to anyone who visited the temple and saw the objects within their own eyes. The shape of the chest and the hole in its door, as well as the location of the chest beside the altar on the right side as one enters to the house of Yahweh. We don't need any inscription for this. Anyone who came to the temple could see it. The method that operated around the chest was visible, making it easy to understand its role. The identity of the gatekeepers, priests who put the silver into the chest, when was the process of sorting and counting the silver took place, and how the method of the renovation at the temple worked. All of these were details that people could see, people were familiar with. Moreover, historical sources reveal the existence of similar collection boxes in temples in Assyria and Babylon. There too, fiscal methods operated around these boxes and were linked to the distant past. The only memory associated with the chest, apart from the technical details, is its link to King Jehoash. In my opinion, this was the main memory detail preserved around the chest in the 2 centuries since it was placed in the temple, when everyone who made a pilgrimage and visited the temple passed by the chest and put their silver in it, and thus knew, remembered, and told of King Joash, who was the one who initiated this chest. This memory was only strengthened and consolidated as soon as it could be used as precedent for the instructions of King Josiah, which led to the cult reform. This was the point when the memory entered the biblical historiography, where the biblical descriptions of Joash and Josiah were integrated into each other, with both comprising the basis for the renovations during which the book of the law was found, which led to the cult reform that was so critical from the perspective of the Deuteronomistic circle in Jerusalem. Another object that was in the temple and carried a historical memory is the altar, or actually the 2 altars that stood in the temple in the days of King Josiah. One altar was erected in the days of Solomon, and sacrifices were made on it from the dedication of the temple until 732 BCE, about 200 years later. It was the altar on which, according to the first book of Kings, chapter 8, verse 64, King Solomon offered the burnt offering and the cereal offering and the fat piece of the peace offering. But then, according to the story detailed in the second book of Kings, chapter 16, Judah was attacked by the Syro-Ephraimite alliance. At that point, the king of Aram Damascus, together with the king of Israel, tried to force King Ahaz, the young king who had just come to power in Judah, to join them in the anti-Assyrian alliance. Ahaz, with his sharp senses, understood that this could be a mistake. Though there were many in Judah who supported joining the alliance and opposed the traditional, moderate, and cautious policy of the kings of Judah, or in the sharp language of the prophet Isaiah, like as he said in chapter 8, verse 6, because these people have refused the waters of Shiloah that flow gently and melt in fear before Retzin and the son of Remaliah, he carried out an act described in the second book of Kings, chapter 16, verse 7 to 9. I'm quoting. So, Ahaz sent messengers to Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, saying, I am your servant and your son. Come up and save me out of the hand of the king of Aram and from the hand of the king of Israel, who are attacking me. And Ahaz took the silver and the gold that was found in the house of Yahweh and in the treasures of the king's house, and sent it to the king of Assyria as a bribe. And the king of Assyria hearkened to him. The king of Assyria marched up against Damascus and took it, carrying its people captive to Kir, and he killed Retzin. End of quote. As part of the process of the enslavement of Judah to Assyria, the meeting between the 2 kings in Damascus is described, an event also well documented by the Assyrian sources that describe the destruction of Damascus by Tiglath-Pileser in 732 BCE. For the historical description in the book of Kings, the meeting between the 2 kings served only as a background to the story of the new altar erected in the temple in Jerusalem. According to the description in the second book of Kings, chapter 16, verse 10a, during Ahaz's stay in Damascus, he saw an altar, apparently of a type he had not known before, and which he liked very much. I'm quoting. When King Ahaz went to Damascus to meet Tiglath-Pileser, king of Assyria, he saw the altar that was at Damascus. The continuation of the same verse describes the actions of Ahaz, who sent a model or a sketch of the altar to the high priest in Jerusalem and gave him instructions to build an altar based on this model in the temple. And this is in verses 10b and 11. I'm quoting. And King Ahaz sent to Uriah the priest a model of the altar and its pattern, exactly in all its details. And Uriah the priest built the altar in accordance with all that King Ahaz had sent from Damascus. So Uriah the priest made it before King Ahaz arrived from Damascus. End of quote. When King Ahaz returned from Damascus, the altar was already in place and immediately replaced the copper altar which had been in use since the days of Solomon and the dedication of the temple. I'm quoting. And when the king came from Damascus, the king viewed the altar. Then the king drew near to the altar and went up on it and burned his burnt offering and his cereal offering and poured his drink offering and threw the blood of the peace offering upon the altar. This is in verses 12 and 13. Since the new altar took the place of the old altar, the old one was moved to make room for the new one. I'm quoting. He brought from the forefront of the house, from between his altar and the house of Yahweh, and put it on the north side of his altar. This is a quote from verse 14. The new altar essentially replaced the old altar, and from that moment on, all temple worship was conducted on it, while according to the king's order, I'm quoting, but the brazen altar shall be for me to inquire by. This is in verse 15. From that moment until the destruction of the temple about 150 years later, this was the altar that operated in the temple, and visitors to the temple who were looking for the bronze altar made by Solomon could find it on the north side of his altar. In my opinion, even in this case, there is no need to look for a chronicle or a written text that would describe the story told in the second book of Kings, chapter 16. The altar itself is the one that carries the memory. The story of Ahaz's visit to Damascus, the sending of the sketch of the altar or the model of it to the high priest in Jerusalem, the instruction to build the altar, and its construction being finished even before the king returned from Damascus to Jerusalem, were known to all who made the pilgrimage to the temple, saw the altar, and listened to the story about it. Moreover, the circumstances of Ahaz's visit to Damascus were also preserved as part of this story. And when the story was incorporated into the Deuteronomistic history, it was first put into writing and incorporated into the relatively broad account of the days of Ahaz's reign. Thus, in this chapter, we've discussed two more examples of events that were in sight and in the minds of the authors of and dealt with the history of Jerusalem and the temple, but in distant and ancient periods of time, about which the authors of the biblical descriptions had no information whatsoever, except for the information preserved as a memory linked to buildings, places, and objects found in Jerusalem. The authors integrated these pieces of information into the broad descriptions of the history of Judah, and thus they became part of the story and of the written history. This chapter summarizes some of the examples in which we dealt with issues related to the untold story of ancient Jerusalem, which were in sight and in the minds of the authors of biblical history, but far away in time. They didn't have much information about these early periods in the history of the city in which they lived and which they knew very well. In the next part of this podcast, We will distance ourselves from Jerusalem and deal with issues far from the sight and far from the minds of those who lived in Jerusalem. Issues that were also far away in time and dealt with the ancient past. We will talk about the untold stories of the lowlands and their history in those ancient times. In this regard as well, we will ask, what sources did the biblical authors use, and where did these authors get the information that they incorporated into their descriptions? We will find out what they told, to whom they told it, and why. And against this background, we can also reveal the untold story.